A tenon jig is one of those shop tools that you can go a long time without, but once you have it, you realize just how useful it can be to make all kinds of cuts that otherwise would be pretty awkward to do on the table saw. The good news is you can make it out of scraps you probably have just lying around. I've seen some really elaborate tenon jigs out there with built-in clamps and micro adjustments. This is not that. This is super simple, and if you wait to the end, I'll show you a few things you can do with it that maybe you weren't expecting. So I started by taking some measurements of my rip fence, both the height and width. Both sides will be 12 inches long, but the right side will be double the height of my rip fence. This will make more sense later. I'm making this out of Medex, which is kind of like MDF but more dense. So dense, in fact, that you'll see me later struggling just to drive screws into it. Next, I lay down 2 layers of blue tape on the rip fence. This just expands the dimensions of the rip fence ever so slightly so that when I remove the tape, the tenon jig will fit snugly but not too tight. I do a test fit using clamps of the sides. This is how I get my accurate measurement of the inside pieces. I use my ruler to set the blade to that exact measurement. I find this to be more precise than the built-in ruler on the table saw, because the measurement is being taken straight off the blade. Then I rip the 2 inside pieces, and I do a dry fit. This tenon jig will have 2 layers. This adds rigidity and also provides a secondary handhold to push the jig when in use. I mark a line and drill and countersink some drywall screws. It is really hard to drive those screws into the Medex, even after pre-drilling. The countersink bit encounters so much resistance that I actually got a few embers on one attempt. You just gotta proceed with caution when it comes to screwing into Medex. Now the first test fit, it slides really nicely. I decided to add a little bit of chamfering on the inside of the bottom legs just to help it glide a little bit more smoothly. Now every tenon jig needs a support cleat, so I just grabbed a spare scrap of plywood, trimmed it to size so it extends beyond the top just a little bit, and drove a screw into one side. This created a pivot point that I could use to create a perfect 90-degree angle to my fence. Then I drove 2 more screws, which guarantees that support cleat will not move. I prefer screws for these shop projects because it makes it really easy to disassemble a jig and replace parts as needed. Now to test it out. I grab a piece of scrap and I mark out some tenons. This is the namesake of the tenon jig and is the primary purpose for having one. I've been using setup blocks lately to set the blade height on the table saw, and it really takes a lot of the guesswork out of setting the height. Highly recommend working this way. Now the maiden voyage. I apply a couple of clamps, then it's simply a matter of moving the fence, lining your marks up with the blade, and letting it rip. Because the marks are symmetrical, to cut the other side, it's simply a matter of flipping the piece around. I decided to have some fun and do cuts on the opposing sides as well. This will create a kind of geometric cutout pattern that is the basis for things like castle joints. I quickly cut out the waist using the miter gauge. This just gives you an idea of the potential for mortise and tenon joinery. Now for something a little different. I've always wanted to use a jig like this to cut rabbets. So I grab a scrap piece of Medex, and sure enough, I was able to get a full rip with the piece standing vertically, and then I simply laid it down flat to cut the waist out. The result was a perfect rabbet. So easy with this kind of jig. Want to see one more thing? You can angle your table saw blade to cut chamfers. When you rotate the piece and have the chamfers meet, you get a really interesting aesthetic look with barely any setup. I don't know of a faster way to create effects like this with wood. Honestly, it's really fun to imagine the potential behind this kind of jig, and now that I have it, I could see myself using it all the time. It has earned its place on the dirty shop floor next to the other jigs. Hope you guys enjoyed this one. Please remember to like and subscribe. I'll see you next time.